Before sunrise, while most of the planet is still asleep, millions of tiny workers are already moving through the dark. They do not need engines, they do not need roads, they do not need orders shouted from above. They rise from hidden chambers, from hollow trees, from waxen cities, from underground nests no human ever sees, and they begin one of the most important jobs on Earth. A bee lands on a flower, and for a moment, it looks almost insignificant. A small body, transparent wings, legs dusted with gold. But that single movement, flower to flower, plant to plant, field to forest, is part of a living network so vast that nearly 90% of wild-flowering plants and more than 75% of the world's food crops depend, at least partly, on animal pollination. And among those pollinators, bees are some of the most important creatures on the planet. So here is the question that changes everything. What would happen if the bees stopped? Not in 1,000 years, not in some distant future, but tomorrow morning. What would happen to the orchards, to the forests, to the birds that feed on seeds and fruit, to the farms that depend on flowers becoming food? And what hidden systems would begin to fail before we even noticed the silence? I'm Nathan Wild, and I've always believed that nature hides some of its greatest miracles in the smallest bodies, and few creatures reveal that better than bees, tiny animals carrying the weight of entire ecosystems on their wings. To understand bees, we have to forget the simple picture most of us carry in our minds. A bee is not just a striped insect hovering around flowers.
It is a navigator, a chemist, a builder, a communicator, a farmer's silent partner, and in some cases, a member of one of the most sophisticated societies in the animal kingdom. But the bee story did not begin with honey. It began with predators. Long before humans cultivated fields, long before fruit orchards stretched across valleys, long before anyone understood pollination, the ancestors of bees were wasp-like hunters. Scientists believe bees evolved from ancient predatory wasps around 120 million years ago, during the age when flowering plants were transforming the land. Somewhere in that deep past, a lineage of hunters began shifting away from feeding their young prey and toward feeding them pollen. Personally, I find that extraordinary. A creature descended from hunters became one of the great partners of flowers. That change may seem small, but it helped shape the living world we know. Flowers offered pollen and nectar. Bees carried pollen between blooms. Plants that attracted better pollinators could reproduce more successfully. Bees that became better at finding, collecting, and transporting floral rewards survived. Over time, this relationship helped build a planet of color, scent, fruit, seeds, forests, and meadows. When a bee enters a flower, it is stepping into an ancient conversation. The flower speaks with fragrance, color, shape, nectar, ultraviolet patterns we cannot see, and timing. The bee answers with movement, memory, touch, and hunger. What looks like a simple visit is actually a negotiation older than humanity. And this is where their hidden world begins to open. There are more than 20,000 known bee species in the world. Only a small fraction live like the familiar honeybee. Many are solitary. Some nest in the ground. Some live in hollow stems. Some are smaller than a grain of rice. Others are large, loud, and covered in dense fur, like bumblebees built for cold mornings and difficult flowers. In the United States alone, there are about 4,000 native bee species, and scientists say around 10% of them have not yet been named or described. Imagine that. In a world mapped by satellites, there are still bees living among us whose stories have not even been given names. Most people think of bees as one animal, but the bee world is more like a hidden continent. There are carpenter bees carving nests into wood, sweat bees shining like drops of green metal, mining bees emerging from the soil in spring, leafcutter bees cutting perfect circles from leaves to line their nests, mason bees sealing their young inside chambers of mud, bumblebees vibrating flowers with a deep electric buzz to release pollen that would otherwise stay locked away. That buzz is not just sound, it is technique.
Some flowers hold their pollen tightly, as if guarding treasure. Bumblebees can use a behavior called buzz pollination, vibrating their flight muscles while gripping the flower, shaking loose pollen in a burst of golden dust. Tomatoes, blueberries, and several wild plants benefit from this kind of vibration. A honeybee cannot do this in the same way. It is a reminder that no single bee species can replace the whole bee world. That is one of the great mistakes we make when we talk about bees. We often imagine saving bees means saving honeybees, and honeybees matter enormously, especially in agriculture. But wild bees are not background characters. They are specialists, local experts, and in many ecosystems, irreplaceable workers. USGS notes that native bees pollinate native plants, support crops like cherries, blueberries, and cranberries, and remain far less understood than honeybees. So when we say bees feed the planet, we are not talking about one species. We are talking about a hidden workforce made of thousands of different lives. Now, step inside a honeybee hive. At first, it feels like chaos. Thousands of bodies moving over wax, wings vibrating, antennae touching, larvae waiting in pale cells. Workers cleaning, feeding, building, guarding, heating, cooling, communicating. The air is warm, alive, and filled with scent. But the longer you watch, the more the chaos becomes order. A honeybee colony is not just a group of insects. It is almost like a single living organism made of many bodies. The queen lays eggs, workers care for the young, build the comb, collect nectar and pollen, guard the entrance, and regulate the hive. Drones are males, present especially during the reproductive season. Britannica describes honeybee colonies as having queens, workers, and drones, with workers and queens being female castes and drones being male. And yet, the queen is not a ruler in the human sense. She does not command the hive like a monarch giving orders from a throne. Her presence is chemical, biological, deeply woven into the colony through pheromones and reproduction. The hive is governed by scent, need, temperature, hunger, space, season, and thousands of tiny decisions made by workers. This is the first mystery of the bee world. How does a society with no central brain act with such precision?
A worker bee may spend parts of her life cleaning cells, feeding larvae, tending the queen, receiving nectar, building wax, guarding the entrance, and finally flying into the outside world as a forager. Her role changes with age, colony needs, and conditions. In darkness, surrounded by thousands of sisters, she becomes one cell in a living superorganism. And the hive must solve impossible problems. It must keep the brood warm. It must store enough food for hard times. It must defend against invaders. It must decide when to swarm. It must choose new nest sites. It must gather information from landscapes that can stretch for miles. And to do that, bees developed one of the most astonishing communication systems in nature: the waggle dance. Inside the darkness of the hive, a forager returns from a rich patch of flowers. She climbs onto the comb and begins to move. A straight run, a vibration, a turn, a loop, then again. To us, it may look like a strange ritual, but to other bees, it can carry a map. The angle of the dance can indicate direction relative to the sun, and the duration of the waggle run can communicate distance to a resource. Recent research continues to study how bees use these dances to communicate location across real landscapes. Think about that for a moment. In the dark, without paper, without speech, without a GPS, a bee can return from the outside world and tell others where to fly. A map written in movement. Every time I see this behavior, I feel the same quiet astonishment. We often measure intelligence by how closely it resembles our own, but bees remind us that intelligence can be small, distributed, chemical, rhythmic, and completely unlike us. And there is more. Bees can learn, they can remember, they can recognize patterns.
Studies have even shown that honeybees can learn to discriminate between images of human faces, despite having tiny brains with far fewer neurons than humans. That does not mean bees understand faces the way we do, but it does reveal something profound. Small brains can solve surprisingly complex visual problems. The more closely we look, the harder it becomes to dismiss them as simple. And yet, outside the hive, their world is brutal. A foraging bee leaves safety and enters a landscape full of risks. Wind can throw her off course, rain can ground her, spiders wait among petals, birds and dragonflies hunt the air.
Pesticides may linger where nectar should be safe. Parasites may cling invisibly to the fate of a colony. Every flight is a wager, but every flight also carries life. When a bee lands on a flower, pollen grains attach to hairs on her body. Some bees have special structures for carrying pollen. Honeybees pack it into pollen baskets on their hind legs. Other bees carry it in different ways, on their bellies, legs, or dense body hairs. As they visit the next flower, some of that pollen may reach the female parts of the plant, allowing fertilization, seeds, and fruit. This is how flowers become food. Not always, not for every crop, not by bees alone. Wind, bats, birds, butterflies, moths, beetles, and flies all play roles in different systems. But bees are among the great pollinating forces of the terrestrial world, and the consequences reach far beyond honey. A world without bees would not mean every plant vanishes overnight. Grasses and cereals like wheat, rice, and corn are largely wind-pollinated. Some crops can self-pollinate. Agriculture is complex, but many fruits, nuts, vegetables, seeds, and wild plants would suffer without animal pollinators. USDA notes that some scientists estimate 1 out of every 3 bites of food exists because of animal pollinators like bees, butterflies, moths, birds, and bats. So the bee is not simply feeding itself, it is helping feed birds, mammals, humans, forests, soil organisms, entire food webs. This is why the title of this story is not an exaggeration. The hidden bee world feeds the planet. If you're drawn to these hidden lives, the workers, builders, predators, and pollinators most people never stop to see, join me on this expedition. Subscribe and keep exploring the secret machinery of nature with me. Now, let's follow the chain a little deeper. A bee pollinates a flower. That flower produces fruit. A bird eats the fruit and spreads the seed. The seed becomes a plant. The plant shelters insects, feeds animals, holds soil, captures water, and adds oxygen to the living rhythm of the land. Somewhere below, fungi connect roots, beetles break down wood, worms turn earth, and above it all, bees continue to move from flower to flower, connecting fragments of life into a network. Nature is not built from isolated creatures. It is built from relationships, and bees are relationship makers. They connect things that cannot move. A flower cannot walk to another flower. A tree cannot cross a meadow to meet another tree, but a bee can carry one plant's future through the air. There is something almost poetic about that, the smallest traveler becoming the messenger of forests. But the bee world also has a darker side, and it is one of the reasons their lives are so gripping. Inside a colony, survival can be ruthless. Weak larvae may be removed, invaders may be killed, rival queens may fight, workers may sacrifice themselves in defense of the hive.
A honeybee that stings a mammal often dies because the barbed stinger can remain lodged in the skin. The colony survives because individuals become part of something larger than themselves. And then there is the moment when a hive splits. Swarming. To a frightened human, a swarm can look like disaster, thousands of bees pouring into the air like a living storm. But to the colony, it is reproduction. The old queen leaves with a mass of workers, searching for a new home, while the original hive raises a new queen. Scouts inspect cavities, they return, they dance, they compare options, and somehow from competing signals, the swarm chooses. A cloud of bees becomes a decision-making body. That is one of the most cinematic spectacles in nature, a society lifting itself into the air. But perhaps the most astonishing part of bees is not what they do when they are abundant. It is what begins to happen when they struggle. Scientists and conservationists warn that pollinators face overlapping pressures: habitat degradation, fragmentation, land use change, pesticides, pollution, pests, pathogens, and climate change. The Pollinator Partnership summarizes these as major threats affecting pollinator populations, and USDA researchers identify varroa mites as one of the most serious problems causing honeybee colony losses today. This is not a single villain story. It is not just one pesticide, not just one parasite, not just climate, not just habitat loss. It is the pressure of many forces at once. A bee colony needs diverse flowers across the season. It needs clean water. It needs safe nesting places. It needs landscapes that do not become biological deserts after a single crop blooms and disappears. Wild bees may need bare ground, hollow stems, specific plants, and stable habitats. Some are specialists, relying on particular flowers. USGS says loss of plant diversity is a primary cause of native bee decline, and that about 30 to 50% of native bees are highly specialized. That means the disappearance of a plant can become the disappearance of a bee, and the disappearance of a bee can become the disappearance of a plant. This is where the hidden danger begins. Nature does not always collapse like a building in a movie. Sometimes it unravels quietly. One missing flower, one missing nesting site, one fewer pollinator, one less seed, one bird returning to a branch with less food than before. At first, the world still looks normal. The grass is still green, the trees still stand, the sky is still blue. But the connections underneath have weakened. And I'll be honest, this is the part of the bee story that stays with me most. Because bees are not only beautiful, they are warnings. Their health tells us something about the landscapes we share with them. A bee cannot survive on concrete. A bee cannot raise young on silence. A bee cannot rebuild a meadow alone. Yet there is hope, and it is not abstract. A roadside filled with native flowers can matter. A garden without unnecessary pesticides can matter. A farm with hedgerows, cover crops, wild margins, and habitat can matter. A city balcony with the right plants can become a tiny station in a larger network. For solitary bees, even a patch of undisturbed soil or hollow stems can become a nursery. The solution is not to romanticize bees. It is to give them back the complexity they need. And to understand why, we need to look at one final extraordinary truth. Bees do not just feed us.
They helped create the world we find beautiful. A meadow in bloom is not just scenery. It is the visible face of millions of relationships. A forest edge humming with bees is not just pleasant sound. It is reproduction, competition, survival, and renewal unfolding in real time. The colors of flowers, the sweetness of fruit, the seeds that feed birds, the berries that carry forests forward, all of it is tied in countless places to pollinators. If bees vanished from a landscape, the first loss might not be dramatic. It might be quiet. Fewer flowers returning next season, fewer fruits forming, fewer seeds carried away, fewer insects feeding on those plants, fewer birds arriving to feed their young, fewer mammals finding food in autumn. A forest that still stands, but with less future inside it. That is the hidden consequence. Bees do not hold up the world like pillars of stone. They hold it together like threads. And when enough threads are cut, the shape of nature begins to change. Still, the bee world is not fragile in the sense of helpless. Bees have survived deep time. They have crossed continents, adapted to deserts, mountains, forests, grasslands, farms, and cities. Some endure cold springs. Some specialize in rare flowers. Some live alone, unseen, in the soil beneath our feet. Their resilience is real. But resilience is not invincibility, and that distinction matters. A honeybee hive can feel immortal when it is healthy. Warm bodies, stored honey, wax walls, a queen laying eggs, workers moving like rivers through the comb, foragers returning with pollen packed against their legs like tiny lanterns. But a colony is also vulnerable to imbalance. Too many parasites, too little nutrition, too much chemical stress, too few flowers across the year.
A changing climate that shifts bloom times. A landscape simplified until bees can fly for miles and still find almost nothing. When we lose diversity, bees lose choices. And when bees lose choices, nature loses options. The mystery scientists are still trying to solve is not simply how to keep bees alive in boxes or how to move honeybee colonies from crop to crop. It is how to protect the full bee world, the wild species, the specialists, the tiny ground nesters, the rare bees that may vanish before many people ever learn they existed. Because a managed honeybee hive can be transported by truck, a wild bee cannot move its ancient relationship with a native flower so easily. And this is why the future of bees is really the future of landscapes. Not only hives, landscapes, fields with flowers, forests with understory blooms, gardens with native plants, farms with habitat, cities with corridors of life.
places where bees do not have to survive on isolated fragments, but can move through a living world. I often think about the first person who truly watched a bee. Not the first person to fear one, not the first to steal honey, but the first to stop long enough to see what was happening. The loaded legs, the careful landing, the body disappearing into the flower, the return to the hive, the dance and darkness, the impossible order of it all. What did they feel? Maybe the same thing we feel now when we finally look closely. A sense that the world is far more intelligent than we imagined. A bee does not know it is feeding the planet. It does not know the names of the fruits it helps create. It does not know the human economies, forests, birds, and families connected to its flight.
It simply follows scent, light, memory, hunger, and the ancient instructions written into its body. And somehow, from that, the world